Please be seated. Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, Council.
Our first witness is Ms. Raha Bahraini from Amnesty International.
And just before the witness is called, can I just announce to everybody that at 11 we will have 2 minutes silence for Remembrance Day. Thank you.
Ms. Bahraini.
Good morning, Ms. Bahraini. Good morning. Oh, can you turn your microphone on? Yeah. It's on?
It's on?
Okay, it's on. Great. And just move the microphone closer to you so we can hear. Yeah, perfect.
Is it good now?
Just a little bit louder.
Is it better now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, great. So what we'll do today, Ms. Bahraini, before you begin is, I believe the chairman has to swear you in.
Good morning.
Repeat after me, if you would, please. I solemnly declare that I will speak the truth,
I solemnly declare that I speak the truth,
the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. So now there'll be questions from Council, followed by questions from the panel.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Bahraini, before, I know you have a presentation that you'd like to show, but before you show that, can you just briefly introduce yourself with your background to the panel and to the audience?
Sure. My name is Raha Bahraini. I'm a human rights lawyer and researcher with more than a decade of experience working in the field of human rights with a particular focus on the situation of human rights in Iran. I'm admitted to practice as a barrister and solicitor in Ontario, Canada. I present this statement in my capacity as Iran researcher at Amnesty International. I have been in this role for the past 8 years, since April 2014, at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International in London. My work at Amnesty International involves conducting and coordinating the organization's research and advocacy activities on Iran, monitoring, investigating, and analyzing legal, political, and social developments reflecting and affecting the situation of human rights in Iran, and providing contextual and thematic expertise, including to the media, the UN, regional bodies, and other influential actors. In this capacity as a researcher, I personally investigated the Iranian authorities' crackdown on the nationwide protests of November 2019 and its aftermath, and was in direct contact with the sources and oversaw the process of obtaining information from the sources outlined in the methodology section, which I will get to briefly. Before I start, though, I would be grateful if a video produced by Amnesty International is first shown to remember and memorialize the victims.
Absolutely.
اینی که اینجا خوابیده پسر منه، همه زندگی من.
Thank you. In my statement, I first would like to provide an overview of Amnesty International's documentation of the patterns of unlawful killings carried out by Iran's security forces during their crackdown on the nationwide protests of November 2019. I will then discuss Amnesty International's investigation into the widespread patterns of human rights violations that were committed by the Iranian authorities against those detained in connection with the protests. These included mass arbitrary arrest and detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and other ill treatment, and flagrant breaches of the right to a fair trial. And I'll conclude with an overview of the crisis of impunity that prevails in Iran for widespread and ongoing patterns of human rights violations and crimes under international law. As part of its investigation into the deadly repression of protests in November 2019, Amnesty International researched cases of protesters and bystanders who were killed by security forces. To date, based on information from credible sources, we've been able to record the details of 320 men, women, and children who were killed by security forces between 15th and 19th of November 2019. We believe and have consistently stressed that the real number of deaths is higher, but it's been important for us to document the details and the names of those identified in order to remember every human life lost and also to reveal the scale of the crackdown waged by the authorities during those horrifying days. We are aware of scores of additional cases that have been reported online, but we've assessed that we do not yet have sufficient reliable details to include them in the current list of identified and recorded victims. This lack of access to information is due in large part to the climate of intense fear and reprisal created by the authorities, which has resulted in fewer families and other informed individuals being willing to speak out. For 148 of the 323 recorded victims, we obtained information from primary sources impacted by the deaths. These included relatives, neighbors, friends, acquaintances, and eyewitnesses. In 134 other cases, we documented the deaths based primarily on information received from human rights activists and journalists. And in 30 remaining cases, we documented the deaths based on information received from medical staff working in facilities to which the dead or the injured were brought. And the remaining 11 deaths were primarily documented based on the examination of videos that were broadcast by the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting Corporation. And these videos included interviews with the families of those killed. And for some of these deaths that were identified through the state media, we were able to subsequently receive information from various sources concerning the victim's name, age, and circumstances of death. In order to ascertain the credibility and accuracy of the information received from human rights activists and journalists, we interviewed them about their sources of information, which typically included relatives, friends, acquaintances, and eyewitnesses again. But due to security concerns, we were not able to speak with their sources directly in those cases. For each recorded case, we conducted extensive internet searches, and where there were media articles or social media posts on the victim concerned, we compared the information available online with the information received directly from primary or secondary sources. As part of our process of cross-checking and corroboration, we also obtained the funeral posters and pictures of the grave sites of as many victims as possible. We currently have this documentation for more than half of the victims. We've been also able to obtain the pictures of the grave sites of 93 victims and of the gravestones, I must say, and the death or burial certificates of 35 victims. As part of our investigation into the unlawful use of lethal force by Iran security forces, we also analyzed extensive video footage and verified them through a rigorous process. And these videos show that Iranian security forces used firearms extensively against unarmed protesters and bystanders. I would like to give a brief overview of the time frame of killings now, and I would be grateful if the map video is shown while I'm speaking. On the 15th of November 2019, sorry, I'm just waiting to see if it's playing. Yes. On the 15th of November 2019, as discussed yesterday, following a sudden announcement by the government about a significant increase in the price of fuel, tens of thousands of people across Iran took to the streets in protest. Early on, protesters went on marches, conducted sit-ins, boycotted petrol stations, created traffic jams with their cars, and handed out flowers to security forces. The focus of the protest quickly expanded from concerns about the price of fuel to broader grievances against the political establishment. These involved demands for the transformation of the country's political system, including constitutional reform and an end to the Islamic Republic system. Iran's security forces responded by acting swiftly to crush the protests, and they used unlawful force, including live ammunition, birdshot, metal plates, tear gas, and water cannon against protesters and bystanders. As protests intensified in most cities across the country, the Iranian authorities ordered different internet service providers to shut down the internet, and they therefore imposed a near total countrywide blackout. Cellular operators in Iran began to disconnect first at around 2 p.m. on the 16th of November, and other operators followed. By 7 p.m. on the 16th of November, Iran had descended into darkness, and that darkness continued until 27th of November. Of the 320 deaths recorded, we've found that at least 6 deaths resulted on the 15th of November. That was the first day of the protest. 111 deaths on the 16th of November. That's the day the internet was shut down, and it was the bloodiest known day of the protest. 85 days on the 17th of November, 31 deaths on the 18th of November, and 1 recorded death on the 19th of November. In 40 additional recorded cases, we've recorded 16 or 17th of November as the date of the fatal incident resulting in death. For others, we don't know the exact date of death, but given the patterns observed, we believe that the vast majority of those deaths also took place on the 16th and 17th of November. That is the second and third day of the protest. I would be grateful if the breakdown of recorded deaths by death is shown now, the image, the third image. As mentioned, the second and third day of the protest were the bloodiest known days of the protest. On the geographic spread of killings, for the 323 victims recorded so far, based on our information, they were killed in 37 cities in 8 provinces across Iran. These included the the central provinces of Alborz, Esfahan, Fars, and Kerman, the western provinces of Kermanshah and Kurdistan, and the southern province of Khuzestan. And this reflects the widespread nature of the lethal crackdown across Iran. The poor suburbs around the capital Tehran suffered most, with at least 176 deaths recorded there so far. The minority-populated provinces of Khuzestan in southern Iran and Kermanshah in western Iran were also badly affected, with 59 recorded deaths for Khuzestan and 30 deaths recorded for Kermanshah. On page 4, paragraph 21, you can see the number of deaths recorded for the other provinces that I mentioned. Some of the victims were participating in protests while others were bystanders, but it has not been possible for Amnesty International to ascertain to which category each victim belonged. In all but 4 cases, the victims were shot dead by Iranian security forces. They included members of the Revolutionary Guards, paramilitary Basij forces, and the police. The vast majority of those killed died from gunshot wounds to their heads, neck, chest, and heart, indicating that the security forces were shooting to kill. According to information received from eyewitnesses and relatives, some victims were shot multiple times in different areas of their bodies, and some were shot in their back while running away from the security forces. For nearly half of the victims, that is 157 to be exact, we've been able to obtain information indicating the reported location of fatal injuries. Based on this information, in at least 70 cases recorded so far, victims were shot in their head or neck, and in at least 52 cases in their torso, including chest and or heart. I would be grateful if you show the perfect, thank you. This chart illustrates a breakdown of the locations of fatal injuries recorded so far, and as you can see, the vast majority were shot in their head or torso. According to extensive research, including video analysis by Amnesty International, in almost all of the protests, there is no evidence that people were in possession of firearms or that they posed an imminent threat to the life or bodily integrity of security forces or others that would have warranted the use of lethal force by security forces. And just a brief note on the age and sex of victims recorded. According to our information so far, of the 320 individuals on whose deaths we've obtained information, at least 241 were identified as adult men and 10 as adult women. In addition, we've documented 22 cases of children who were killed. 21 were boys aged between 12 and 17, and 1 was a girl reportedly aged between 8 and 12. For 200 victims, we have currently information about their exact or approximate age. Based on this information, the majority of the recorded victims, at least 44%, were in their 20s, and 26% were in their 30s. I would be happy to answer any question about the patterns of unlawful killings, but if there is time, I could also speak about the patterns of mass arrests, enforced disappearances, and torture also.
If you'd like to do that for a little bit, go ahead.
Following our documentation of unlawful killings during the protests, Amnesty International also investigated the patterns of serious human rights violations that were committed against those detained in connection with the protests. These included arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and other ill treatment. The Iranian authorities waged a mass campaign of repression that led, according to official statements, to the arrest of more than 7,000 men, women, and children. These arrests, according to information available in different news and human rights websites, as well as cases reported to Amnesty International and official statements, the arrests took place in 28 of Iran's 31 provinces. Our findings show that many of the arrests took place during the 5 days of protest, but in the days and weeks that followed, the pattern of mass arrests continued. Individuals who had participated in the protests were identified through images taken by security forces or surveillance cameras and were arrested from their homes or workplaces, and in the cases of some children, at their schools. Many protesters and bystanders were also arrested from hospitals while seeking medical care for life-threatening gunshot wounds or other injuries sustained during the protest. Many of those detained in connection to the protests were subjected to incommunicado detention and enforced disappearance for days, weeks, or even months, while held in undisclosed locations. Many detainees were held in detention facilities which were either official secret detention places or facilities which are official and are referred to as security detention facilities. These are run by security and intelligence bodies, including the Ministry of Intelligence and the Revolutionary Guards. Other detainees were held in overcrowded prisons or police stations with little or no access to their families. In some cities, the authorities also use military barracks, sport venues, and schools as detention facilities. The authorities frequently threatened families with arrest if they kept seeking information about their loved ones or publicly spoke out about them. During those horrifying days, many families were left in fear about whether their loved ones were even dead or alive, and this was while there were mounting reports of deaths across the country, and the Iranian authorities were refusing to return the bodies of those killed to their families, as well as there were also reports of deaths in custody, causing families deep mental distress and anguish. Testimony from victims' families, eyewitnesses, and lawyers, and reports from human rights defenders inside Iran and human rights organizations outside Iran reveal that police, intelligence, and security forces and prison officials used widespread torture and other ill treatment against men, women, and children detained in connection to the protests, both during arrest and later in detention centers and prisons across the country. According to information obtained by Amnesty International, torture was used to punish, humiliate, and intimidate detainees. It was also used as an interrogation tactic to elicit self-incriminating statements and confessions. Frequently, victims recounted being hooded and blindfolded and then being punched, kicked, flogged, beaten with sticks, rubber hose pipes, batons, and cables, suspended from the ceiling, forced into holding painful, stressful positions for prolonged periods, deprived of sufficient food and drinkable water, and placed in prolonged solitary confinement, sometimes for weeks or even months. We also received information from primary sources on interrogators belonging to security and intelligence bodies and prison officials stripping detainees and spraying them with cold water and subjecting detainees, including children, to extreme temperature or bombardment of light or sound over a sustained period, forcible extraction of the nails from fingers or toes, pepper spraying, forced administration of chemical substances, electric shocks, waterboarding, and mock executions. These are methods of torture which correspond to long-standing patterns of torture documented by Amnesty International and other human rights organizations in Iran. In some cases, we also receive information from primary sources, including victims' relatives, and sources inside prisons, that interrogators and prison officials perpetrated sexual violence against male detainees. This included stripping and forced nakedness, invasive body searches intended to humiliate the victims, sustained sexual verbal abuse, pepper spraying the genital area, and administering electric shocks to the testicles. In all cases documented by Amnesty, victims also reported various forms of psychological torture aimed at obtaining forced confessions. These commonly included persistent use of degrading verbal insults and profanities, death threats and threats of further torture against detainees, threats to arrest, torture, kill, or otherwise harm detainees' family members, including parents, children, and spouses, and threats to rape detainees or rape their family members. The authorities also subjected detainees to torture and other ill treatment by deliberately depriving them of access to medical treatment and medication for injuries sustained during the protests from gunshot wounds and beatings, as well as for injuries sustained as a result of torture. To date, no public official in Iran has been investigated, let alone prosecuted and held accountable for ordering and committing the grave human rights violations and crimes under international law committed during and in the aftermath of the protests of November 2019. The crisis of impunity has gone beyond the failure to ensure accountability. The authorities have praised security forces for swiftly ending the unrest and have celebrated the crackdown as a crushing victory and a heroic achievement by security forces. This crisis of impunity has been accompanied by the persecution and ongoing intimidation and harassment of families and others calling for justice. In the aftermath of the protests, victims' families suffered various forms of restrictions for memorializing their victims, and they continue to face arbitrary arrest and detention, intimidation, harassment, and abusive interrogations for seeking justice and denouncing impunity. I will end here and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
Bahraini. The first question that I have is probably an uncomfortable one for experts to always hear, but I have to ask it. Amnesty International is usually considered to be a Western NGO, and the government of Iran is no different than many governments that may dismiss the information that comes from Amnesty as being Western propaganda. Can you describe or explain what kind of relationship Amnesty International has with the Iranian government and whether you have ever worked with them on any issues whatsoever with regards to the reports that you release?
For every report that Amnesty International issues, we send letters in advance of the publication of the report to the Iranian authorities and invite them to provide comments on the findings and to meet with us in order to discuss the concerns and recommendations put forward by Amnesty International. The Iranian authorities generally do not respond to the communications of the International Secretariat of Amnesty International in London. However, on some cases, usually related to imminent executions, they do engage with the national offices of Amnesty International in various countries. On a quarterly basis, Amnesty International sends a letter to the Permanent Mission of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Geneva and raises its concerns and reiterates its request for a meeting with the Iranian authorities in Geneva or at another convenient, mutually convenient location. The Iranian authorities do not generally respond to these requests. On state media outlets in Iran, the work of Amnesty International on other countries, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, the US, and China are heavily cited, and the authorities treat Amnesty's report on these other countries as reliable or worthy of reporting. However, when it comes to the organization's work on Iran, they either dismiss the reports as propaganda or characterize the organization's work on Iran as being affiliated with opposition groups or foreign governments.
Wonderful, thank you. There may be more follow-up questions regarding that issue. So let's talk now about the methodology that was used. Can you briefly explain what the video verification process is when you analyze the videos that were shown to you regarding the protests?
Sure. So the video verification process was done with the help of our experts in video verification at Amnesty International's Crisis Evidence Lab, as well as the help of members of Amnesty International Digital Verification Corps at the universities of Cambridge and Pretoria. The verification methodology includes analysis of the origin of the content, the time and date when the event depicted occurred, the location where the content was captured, as well as identifying and corroborating evidence that supports what is shown in the content. The first step that we always take when trying to verify an image or video is to evaluate whether what we are viewing is original content, and if not, to establish when the content first appeared online. As you know, there is always the possibility that a piece of content may be falsely linked or distributed in connection connection with an event that may have nothing to do with the original incident. In order to ensure this aspect of the process, we conducted a reverse image search on photo or stills from the videos that were sourced from social media platforms in most cases. And through this process, we established if the content had appeared online before the date of the event in question, and if that was the case, this would suggest that the video is being shared out of context or used in a misleading manner. After establishing the origin of the video, we tried to establish the date and time when a video or image was captured. This is crucial to verify whether a piece of evidence is likely connected to a particular event. For establishing the precise date and time of when a video was recorded, when we received the video from our sources, the media file included metadata that helped us with the determination of the time and date. But because the vast majority of the videos were sourced through social media platforms, and social media platforms almost always remove metadata from all media files uploaded, we could not rely on metadata, and as a result, we mainly relied at the time stamp of the content when it was uploaded, and this gave an indication of time. We also try to corroborate by using other evidence such as news reports that specified the time of the incident under investigation, and we looked at the upload times of other content that appear to be from the same event. For each piece of video footage received or found online, we try to verify the location where it was captured. It is commonplace to find content captured in one location, transposed to another, or for users to make incorrect allegations about the location where an event took place. To geolocate video footage, our verification experts and our own team looked for unique geographical features such as buildings, street signs, shop fronts, or other reference points that could be detected on satellite imagery or mapping tools such as Google Maps and Google Earth. Finally, in addition to corroborating information regarding the date, time, and location of the video footage, we compared this open source evidence to witness testimony that we had collected to further confirm the incidents depicted in the videos. Overall, sorry, I just want to... Overall, we received 1,000 videos from the NGO Justice for Iran. Due to capacity concerns, we verified 100 videos that we subsequently featured in a website that we launched for the first anniversary of the protests in November 2020. This website mainly features videos that show the repeated use of firearms and other unlawful force by the security forces, and they concern 31 cities in 16 provinces.
Thank you. I want to move now to some of the victims that we know of were impacted by the protests. And one specific group I would like to focus on are children or minors, anyone under the age of 18. And in some of the statements that Council received, there is references to the fact that children were impacted by the violence. Can you talk about what you know of what happened with children during the November 2019 protests?
Yes, as I mentioned, we've documented at least 22 children who were killed during the protests. And we issued a report in February 2020 that is focused on the killings of minors during the protests and discusses in detail the circumstances in which these children were killed. Some of them were returning from school, and others were shot while participating in the protests. In addition, the Iranian authorities arrested hundreds of children across the country. Reports received by Amnesty International raised concerns that in the province of Kermanshah alone, in the province of in the provinces of Kermanshah, Khuzestan, and Kurdistan alone, hundreds of children were arrested for their real or suspected participation in the protests. According to reports from informed sources inside and outside Iran, scores of school children were also arrested from several schools in Marivan. The sources also told Amnesty International that tens of children, including some who were as young as 12, were arrested in the cities of Sanandaj and Saqqez, both in the western province of Kurdistan, and transferred to juvenile correction facilities in the city of Sanandaj, which is the capital of Kurdistan province. In the city of Kermanshah, in the western province of Kermanshah, dozens of children were also arrested and held with little or no access to their families in detention centers belonging to the police and the intelligence unit of the Revolutionary Guards. Ahwazi Arab human rights defenders and civil society organizations in Iran also reported that hundreds of children between the ages of 9 and 17 were arrested and detained in the city of Ahvaz, Khuzestan, in the southern province of Khuzestan. Informed sources from the province of Kohgiliye and Buyar Ahmad also told Amnesty International and that in the weeks following the protests, security forces arrested dozens of children between between the ages of 11 and 17 in the small city of Likak in that province. Uniformed police and plainclothes agents arrested some children from their homes while others were removed from their classrooms. An informed source told Amnesty International that during arrests, security agents removed children from classrooms while beating them and using stun guns against them to deliver electric shocks. According to information gathered by Amnesty International, all the children were initially detained in the city of Laklak in a police station when they were interrogated without a guardian or a lawyer present and subjected to torture and other ill treatment through beatings. Following interrogations, they were transferred to either a juvenile correction facility in the city of Yasuj or to the prison in the city of Dehtash, both in Kohgiliye and Buyar Ahmad province. Some were held alongside adults, which put them at increased risk of abuse. And according to information received from an informed source, many of them bore psychological signs of trauma after release, including behavioral changes such as aggression and loss of interest in schoolwork. Children also emerged from detention centers with broken arms and broken teeth and cuts and wounds all over their bodies. We have also received some allegations of sexual abuse, including rape against children, and if there is further time, I could address them as well.
Okay, my final question, and I'm going to hand it over to the panel, is in your expert opinion, you've been with Amnesty International since 2014 working on the issues in Iran. Have you ever seen violence or other situations to this scale as you've seen in November 2019?
The November 2019 crackdown was unprecedented and was the most lethal crackdown observed in Iran since the 1980s.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Counsel.
Good morning, and thank you for being here this morning. I have one quick question, which is, did Amnesty get a sense of the number of people countrywide who were involved in the protests, and then secondly, the number of people countrywide who were arrested as a result?
Tens of thousands of protests are believed to have participated in the protests. This is based on both the official statements of the authorities and the reports available on state media outlets, as well as the videos that have emerged from various cities across the country, which show the mass participation of people in the protests. Regarding the number of arrests, to this date, the exact number remains unknown, and the Iranian authorities have refused to provide any information about the number of those arrested at the time and the number of those who remain in detention or the number of people who've received prison sentences. We issued a report last September, in September 2020, and in the context of researching that report, we looked at the reports published by various organizations and state media reports, and we identified over 500 people who had been subjected to criminal proceedings in connection with the protests, but we certainly believe that the real number of those targeted is much higher. A member of the parliament stated briefly after the shortly after the protest, that over 7,000 men, women, and children had been arrested during the protest, and this figure that is cited everywhere is basically based on that official statement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Yaqub.
Thank you very much for that very interesting evidence. To talk a little bit about arrest to start with. Do you have any record of family members of people who were killed during the protest having been arrested?
Having been arrested?
Yes.
So we know that families were threatened with arbitrary arrest and detention.
Let me say, you do say in your report that individuals that attended funeral services of one kind or another were arrested. Those may have been families, and there's an interesting linkage there, but I was more interested in families separately, just to place the thing in context. Yeah.
So families and human rights defenders were, in some cases, temporarily arrested in the context of participating in ceremonies. But we do not have, other than one case, the father of Puya Bakhtiari, we heard about him yesterday. We do not have any information on families who were subjected to prolonged arbitrary detention and arrest. At the moment, the father of Puya Bakhtiari, Manucher Bakhtiari, is in prison. He was arrested in April and subsequently sentenced to 3 years imprisonment in July, and he remains in detention. Other families, they've been interrogated repeatedly, summoned for interrogations and threatened with arbitrary arrest and detention, but we are not aware of anyone who was held for more than several hours.
Now, you may have heard the evidence yesterday that protests took place in 19 of the 31 provinces. I asked some questions about that, and there may be uncertainty about that figure. But what interests me for comparison purposes is that according to your report, I'm sorry I don't have the page number of it, but I'm sure you'll find it quickly enough, arrests occurred in 28 of the 31 provinces.
Yes.
Now, if protests occurred only in 19, then there were arrests in 9 provinces in the absence of process. That's what straightforward logic says, but I'd like you to comment on that, please.
Based on the information available on state media outlets and information that is available on the websites of media organizations and human rights organizations and cases reported to Amnesty International, we believe that protests did in fact take place in 28 provinces of Iran's 31 provinces. This would have been the only reason that arrests were also carried out in these provinces. I don't remember the context in which 19 provinces was mentioned yesterday. It might have been related to the videos that are available from the protest. For some provinces, we have more video footage than others. The videos that we've been able to analyze and verify are from 16 provinces, which is close to the 19 mentioned yesterday. And as I mentioned, we received over 1,000 videos from the organization Justice for Iran. So there are certainly videos from like 3 or more provinces that we haven't included. But I think the scale of the province was certainly wider than the 16 or 19 provinces mentioned.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, on the assumption that you are right about the 28 provinces, I'm not saying that there's a big possibility that Amnesty is wrong. I am interested in the characteristics, or whatever that might be, of the 3 provinces in which there were no protests, because that sounds interesting to me, and it might mean something as a stat if we try and look at it, maybe where the provinces were, it may be the population, it may be an upmarket province, it may be a particularly poor province. Can you help with that at all?
That's a difficult question to answer.
I'm sorry.
There might have been a smaller protest in those provinces as well, in those 3 provinces. We arrived at the figure of...
No, I understand that. They may have been smaller, but they were so small that they weren't noticed, right? So why are 28 provinces worthy of mention and 3 not? Now, I wondered whether you do the Commission a favor and look at that a little. Do you think do you have information around which may enable you to help us? I'm sure that that council have also taken note, and they will make the investigation. But do you think you might be able to help us?
I cannot think of any specific characteristics that would distinguish these provinces from others.
Can you name those 3 provinces, please? Is that possible?
Yes, so I have them recorded somewhere, but if it's okay, I'll mention them to you afterwards, because I need to go back and make sure that I'm remembering the correct ones.
Just make sure it's right, and give us the names of the provinces and give them to council, so that if they agree with me that those 3 provinces may be of some relevance, that we might look at them.
Certainly, I will give them to you immediately after, when I can check the report that we issued in September 2020. It's noted in the report entitled Trampling Humanity.
Thank you very much.
I'd just like to provide one additional clarification. The 28 provinces are those from which reports of arrest are available. These reports of arrest were either mentioned by the authorities themselves, or they were reported by human rights organizations.
Yes, I understand. You've listed the provinces in your report. I see that. But I didn't have the opportunity to look at all 31 and tick one off against the other. So I'm trying to ask you to do some of my own dirty work for me. All right.
I'm sorry, I couldn't be more helpful.
No, I'm sure you'll be more helpful in the future. A bit more about let's put it this way, the burning of property. Banks, police stations, police motor vehicles, private motor vehicles, and so on. Why were there, for example, more banks than private motor vehicles? I can understand, there may be a reason. Let me put it to you this way. I was very interested in why there were so many banks compared to all the other entities. I could, in my own mind, speculate about police motor vehicles, because maybe they were too much protected or something. police stations may have been less because they were protected. The answer may be that the banks had protection, but from what you understand of the social circumstances, apart from the fact that they may not have been particularly protected, in the social psyche of the nation, of poor people in the nation, is there something about banks that you might know of?
I think I should first note that while there is video footage that shows acts of vandalism and arson, it's not possible for Amnesty International to establish the identities of those engaging in those acts.
No, that I understand, yes.
And we've received various testimonies from protesters who've said that individuals in civilian clothes were seen engaging in acts of vandalism and arson against banks or petrol stations, but they were operating alongside security forces or with the apparent acquiescence of security forces. These are not reports that we've been able to verify independently, but there are concerns that, in fact, some individuals in civilian clothes affiliated with security bodies engage in many of these acts of arson and vandalism. In that case, then it would be difficult to comment on why protesters would have committed this, because we do not even know the identities of those involved in such
No,
acts.
I understand.
Sorry to interrupt. Please, could we all rise and have 2 minutes silence for Remembrance Day? Sorry to interrupt the flow, but please continue.
Thank you very much. And since I have the word, I think I speak for all of us when I express my sadness, extreme sadness and regret at these occurrences, and express the hope that there will be some form of redress. So to my simple way of thinking, there is a kind of symbiotic relationship, I suppose, between the increase of fuel prices and the burning of petrol stations. I'm not saying logic, because logic doesn't quite get you there. There is less of a symbiotic relationship between high petrol prices and banks. So again, my trouble is, why more banks than petrol stations? You think you can add anything to that?
We talked to 60 people who were subjected to arbitrary arrest and detention in connection with the protests, as well as 2 protesters who were in hiding and had not been arrested between November 2019 and August 2020. These individuals that we talked to repeatedly insisted that they had not engaged in such acts of arson and vandalism. So we do not have any testimony that could shed light on the possible grievances that might have allegedly led to such acts. The information we received and the testimonies we received constantly highlighted that they have deep grievances against the political establishment that go beyond anger with the fuel price. They involved deep anger against the supreme leader and other top officials, and the protesters that we talked to, many of them said they were not just talking about the price of fuel, and they wanted substantial structural changes within Iran's political system. They also maintained that their participation in the protest was peaceful, or they, in some cases, they said they put vehicles on fire or they engaged in throwing stones in order to confront the security officers who were firing tear gas at them or subjecting them to beatings before the use of lethal force started, which then led to many protesters just running away. Because of this context, basically, I do not have any access to those individuals who might have allegedly engaged in such acts and the motivations behind these reported acts of arson and vandalism by the authorities.
Maybe you'll be relieved to know that that answer takes me to my last line of questioning. This is about power relations and power structures and struggles between powerless and powerful people. And by powerless people, let's get the definitions right. On the one side are relatively poor people, middle income, below middle income to bottom level. And at another level, we're looking at those who are powerful in terms of the police force and the army and so on. And we're looking at economic and financial power in relation to big business. I think you know where I'm going to. Now, is it right that you have come across no powerful person, no big name, no person who falls in the upper classes, who A, has died, or B, has been subjected to torture, or C, has suffered, apart from the owners of banks, of course, who probably suffered a great deal of financial damage. But let's confine ourselves to death, torture, and arrest. Mm-hmm. Is there any justification for the analysis that it was generally the economically and otherwise less powerful people who were victims of these things? Mm-hmm. Would that be a fair inference?
It is a fact that the protests mostly took place in poor suburbs, and those participating in the protests were from the impoverished sectors of the society. We have not logged systematically the occupation and educational background of those killed during the protest. However, based on just general information that we've received in the context of that research, there are many young men killed who were university graduates, they were engineers, vets, medical students, nurses, and individuals from a teaching background. So it would, while they may have originated from poor suburbs, or their families might have come from that background, and that's why the focus of the protest, for example, in Tehran and Alborz provinces were those suburbs around the capital Tehran. The individuals involved were also moving toward obtaining a university degree that might have changed their class. All this to say that it would be hard, I believe, to generalize about the economic background of all those targeted. The suburbs where the protest took place give us an indication that economic grievances were a major factor, but that's not the whole picture, and there were certainly people from middle classes who also participated in the protest. As for the ones who were from poor backgrounds, I have some testimonies in the Trampling Humanity report that shed light on who they were. For example, there is one young man, Abul Fazl Karimi, not a man, actually a boy, a 17-year-old boy, and he mentions very clearly that before his arrest, he worked in a shoe factory and was the main breadwinner in their home. And he took to the streets specifically because of the increase in fuel and food prices and the crisis that he faced due to Iran's economic situation. In his testimony, he also mentions that he took to the streets because he saw his ailing mother and father, and that his expenses were greater than his income, and that this caused, and seeing his ailing mother and father caused him great pain, and this is why he and many other people took to the streets. There were others who mentioned in their testimony that they took to the streets because of this growing deep anger and dissatisfaction with the political establishment.
Okay, I can't remember the reading now, but you might help me. My knowledge is that fire, because it's easy to cause in a sense, you use matches and petrol, etc., etc. Fire has been the weapon of powerless people, and it's a well-known fact that powerless people have used that method since time immemorial. Would you know anything? Would you have done any studies at that level?
I have not done any studies on this issue. Just going back to the testimonies of protesters who said individuals believed to be affiliated with security forces engaged in acts of arson, some protesters mentioned that they would see groups of individuals in civilian clothes who suddenly appeared in front of a bank with large gallons of gas that they then used to put the banks on fire. They were basically trying to suggest in their testimonies that this was a coordinated act, and protesters who had taken to the streets earlier would not have been able to engage in such level of coordinated, organized arson, arriving at the scene, quickly putting the property on fire and leaving. The video footage available, unfortunately, is not closed and detailed enough to give a sense of who was involved in these acts of arson and how they exactly happened. In some places, for example, in one city in the Fars province, Mauliabad, a police station was partially burned, and this took place after the use of lethal force in that city led to a number of deaths and sparked outrage and anger. So I'm not discounting the reports that civilians also allegedly engaged in the protest, but given the absence of information and the fact that we have not been able to speak to like hundreds of people across different locations, it's really difficult to get into the possible motivations.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you misanticipate me. It certainly doesn't follow from the historical weapons used by powerless people that only poor people cause the fires in this case. That certainly doesn't follow, because it is also well known in history that one of the things that powerful people do and have done is that they mimic what powerless people do in order to ensure that their badness is multiplied very much. So I was not trying to imply that it was caused. You see, the fact that if it is true in history that this is the tool traditionally used, weapon traditionally used in struggles by powerless people, then it is also true that powerful people mimic this in order to pretend that powerless people did more than they actually did. Do you follow that?
I do.
Right, but let's just get to the facts a little bit. You gave us a very interesting account of the patterns of death, right? First, second, third, fourth day. I wondered whether there is some sort of pattern available, A, for fires, and B, for arrests. Because if there were, I think you'd understand that the comparisons could be revealing indeed.
The patterns between
the patterns of fires, like you said, the minimum number of people died on Saturday, or on the first day, maximum on the second day, less on the third day, 30, and less on the fourth day, and one on the last day, right? So that was an interesting pattern which goes up and down. I'm not interested in the actual numbers. They show you a pattern, right? Now, I just wondered whether there is something like that sort of pattern available in relation to, I mean, if one knew how many banks were burned on the first day, second day, third day, fourth day, how many petrol stations, it may be possible to make something of that data. And that's why I'm interested in whether the same sort of pattern might be available for fires and arrests in particular.
As far as I'm aware, this information is not available. The Iranian authorities have just published a number of general figures about the number of, on the number of petrol stations and banks and vehicles that were put on fire during the course of the protest. They have not given a breakdown by day about the acts of arson allegedly committed. On the possible correlation between the acts of arson and the patterns of unlawful killings, I must note that we've analyzed dozens of videos where the security forces are firing live ammunition. And in the video footage, you see protesters falling onto the ground or dead bodies being carried by other protesters. And in these videos, there is no evidence of a fire going on in the background.
Yes.
The people are just in the street chanting, and you see security forces suddenly starting shooting at them. In other words, it would be a misperception presented by the authorities to suggest that they started firing when there was massive fire going on. There's just not that correlation, at least from the video evidence available.
Yeah. There is another indicator, though. 200 liters of fuel might imply a powerful act, and 2 liters of fuel might imply a powerless act. But this is more for counsel to take note. I'm just using you as a little tool to convey information. I'm sorry about that, and thank you. I have no further questions, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bahraini, for your evidence. It's been very helpful. I just have a few questions. As a long-term researcher at Amnesty International on Iran, I imagine you've had occasion to research protests before November 2019. Are you able to give the panel some information about how this protest differed from other protests and how the response differed from other responses to protests?
The scale of the crackdown was horrific and unprecedented. I started working for Amnesty in April 2014, and the first nationwide protest that took place in Iran after I started my work at Amnesty was in December 2017, January 2018. Those were also nationwide protests that were again rooted in economic grievances. The use of lethal force then was also horrific and something that shook us and others in Iran and around the world. According to the authorities, during those protests, which lasted several weeks, 21 people were killed. Unfortunately, little information subsequently emerged, so we, in general, have not been able to document the number of deaths during those protests like we did for November 2019. So in my time at Amnesty, the protests of November 2019 was the greatest crisis that we ever worked on. And we were never ready for such a widespread and systematic use of live ammunition across the country. The internet shutdown was also unprecedented in its severity and scale and duration. The fact that for more than 2 weeks we were completely cut off from inside the country and had no access to information was horrific, and it really impeded our access to information, and we believe that an unknown amount of evidence was lost because of the internet shutdown. Looking historically, the nationwide protests in 2009 were followed, so they were the largest at the time, and the next largest protests were the 2019. In 2009, the killings were also large in scale, but I was not working at Amnesty International at that time, so I would not be able to comment on how the patterns around the use of force were different. But it is a well-established fact that the lethal crackdown was the worst seen in Iran since the 1980s, when the Islamic Republic of Iran was trying to establish itself as a new entity and resorted to mass repression, and tens of thousands of people were arrested and thousands were extrajudicially or summarily executed.
Thank you. And I have some questions about your written evidence. If you could turn to paragraph 47, which concerns torture and ill treatment. Mm-hmm. And in your evidence, you indicate that torture and ill treatment was widespread. Mm-hmm. And I would like to ask you if you can provide some information to the panel on why you viewed the torture and ill treatment as widespread, mm-hmm. both in terms of numbers or places or any other indicia.
Mm-hmm. We talked to 60 victims who were in detention centers in various places across Iran. Based on their testimony and the information that emerged from the work of other human rights organizations, we learned that on a wide basis across various detention centers, detainees were subjected to beatings once they arrived at the detention center, and they were also arrested during the they were also subjected to beatings during the course of arrest. Given the number of arrests that took place, according to the authorities, 7,000 or more, and the testimony from detention centers that routinely prison officials and security and intelligence bodies use torture, we believe that the pattern of torture was widespread across the country. It also corresponds to long-established patterns in the country that individuals are subjected to torture and other ill treatment at the time of arrest and during the interrogation when they are most vulnerable and are under duress to give forced confessions. On the beatings, for example, we have one video which was shared on the 24th of November, and it shows handcuffed detainees being taken into the grounds of a police station and then beaten, punched, and kicked by security forces. That's in the province of Fars, which is in central Iran. In Rajai Shahr prison in Karaj, Alborz province, which is the center of Iran, we receive information from credible sources inside that prison that hundreds of detainees, including children, were brought in trucks to the prison on the 16th of November. And from that day onward, on the 16th of November, and from that day onward, and the sources told Amnesty International that handcuffed and blindfolded detainees were stripped of their clothes, punched, kicked, flogged, and beaten daily with batons by prison guards and security officials. Similar credible accounts were gathered by Amnesty and also reported by human rights activists and organizations of repeated beatings of detainees in prisons and detention centers, including in the provinces of Esfahan in central Iran, Kermanshah and Kurdistan in western Iran, Khuzestan in southern Iran, Khorasan Razavi in northeastern Iran, Mazandaran in northern Iran, and Tehran, the capital of the country. We also received information that many detainees, including children, emerged with broken teeth, arms, and legs, and cuts and bruises visible on their bodies, and they told us that other detainees also emerged from prison with similar injuries. All this together led us to conclude that torture and ill treatment was used on a widespread basis across the country.
Thank you. And in relation to the authors of this ill treatment, were there any patterns about certain treatments by certain types of authors?
The perpetrators?
Yes.
So the perpetrators, by and large, included members of the Revolutionary Guards who run their own detention facilities in the country, officials of the Ministry of Intelligence who again run their own detention centers in various places, and some prison officials. The methods of torture, which included suspension from the ceiling, administration of electric shocks, and mock executions and painful, stressful positions, those were committed, according to the testimonies we had, in the context of interrogations and for the purpose of seeking forced confessions. The sexual violence against male detainees, like stripping them naked or bombarding them with sound and light, or depriving them of access to medication, medical treatment, food and water, prison officials were heavily involved, and they took place in the context of overcrowded prisons at the time. I should also note that the perpetrators do include prosecution officials who renewed the detention orders, who issued instructions to those carrying out the interrogations to use torture and other ill treatment to obtain evidence, and ordered that individuals are cut off from the outside world and denied access to their families and lawyers while being interrogated. Subsequently, judges presiding over the Revolutionary Courts dismissed allegations of torture and relied on these confessions, which the detainees said were extracted under torture, to issue convictions. So they should be counted as alleged perpetrators.
Thank you. And in terms of your evidence of related to these instructions that were issued by prosecution authorities. Where does that evidence come from? Is that from the victims, or do you have copies of written instructions?
We do not have any written documentation. It's based on our long-term analysis of the legal system in Iran and the relevant procedures of Iran's Code of Criminal Procedure, which identify prosecutors as the officials responsible for issuing detention orders and for renewing detention orders. So it's based on an established pattern in the country that we know involves prosecution authorities.
Okay. And if I can turn quickly to the digital verification evidence. In your written evidence, you indicate that the eyewitness accounts provide clear evidence that those using firearms against protesters and bystanders belong to Iran's security forces, including Revolutionary Guards, paramilitary Basi forces, and police. So in respect to this information, are you able to clarify on what basis those identifications were made? So for instance, the team of digital verification staff working to identify these patterns, on what basis did they make a connection to different security forces?
For members of the police and the special units of the police, and in some cases the Revolutionary Guards, the analysis is based on the uniforms that the security officials are wearing and the helmets that they are wearing, which identify the forces they belong to. When it comes to plainclothes agents who were firing live ammunition, it's mainly based on the analysis of the location of the protesters versus the location of the security forces. In some videos, you very clearly see groups of uniformed officers stationed next to plainclothes officers next to them, and the plainclothes officials also fire at the protesters. If they were civilians, they would not be standing next to the uniformed officials firing at protesters without facing any consequences. Other organizations, including Justice for Iran, have done detailed analysis of the videos available, which clearly indicate the forces in each city. We haven't done that level of detailed analysis to establish, for example, in each city what kind of forces were involved based on the video evidence available. But the pattern overall emerges that these were Ministry of Intelligence, these were Revolutionary Guards, Basij that's run by the Revolutionary Guards and the police.
Thank you.
Could I ask a few questions, please? Firstly, in relation to your written evidence, and I'm particularly interested in your conclusion that the real number of deaths is higher. And I just want to understand why you came to that conclusion. And I guess as part of that, what kind of proof, standard of proof you were looking at when determining when you could be certain or when you could be sure that a particular reported death was in fact a death.
Regarding your first question as to the real number of those killed, because of the climate of impunity in Iran, and the intense fear that exists, we know that many families have not stepped forward. This is because in November 2019, we issued 2 phone numbers that invited people with information to contact us. And at the time, some of the primary sources who contacted us were neighbors or friends of those killed, and they sent us memorial posters in their neighborhood that showed the individual killed, or they sent us videos of the memorial ceremony that they attended, but we were never able then to gather additional information from the families of those killed, like from the relatives, to obtain more detailed information. So many immediate family members did not come forward.
Sorry to interrupt. So you always demanded first-hand evidence from a close family member, or no?
No. So as I mentioned in the methodology section, we have mostly two categories of sources. Almost half of the victims, we identify them from through primary sources. And by primary sources, we mean relatives, immediate relatives, but we also mean others with access to information, direct information, like friends, neighbors, acquaintances who attended the memorial ceremony, and eyewitnesses who saw the person being killed during the protest. The other source for most of the victims, or for the remaining half, were activists and journalists who had access to their own primary sources. And in those cases, we basically try to ascertain the credibility by interviewing the activists and journalists and find out to what extent they have been able to gather basic details such as name, date of death, and location of death. We tried to compare this information that these secondary sources provided us with the information available online. If there were a lot of discrepancies, and or there were a lot of unknowns, like we had nothing on the date, we had nothing about the circumstances, the age, or there were various names that appear to refer to the same person, then we didn't include it. But if the information available was consistent across various platforms and sources, then we included it. So it wasn't a very strictly high standard, but we always ensured that we try to ascertain the credibility and ensure consistency. One other reason that we believe the real number is higher is that there are dozens of names reported online. Many of them were reported in the immediate aftermath of the protest, and nothing has emerged, nothing to shed further light on the actual name of these people and on the date and circumstances of their death. As a result, today we also issued another document with nearly 100 names, and we've encouraged anyone with information to contact Amnesty International. For us, it's important that we identify as many victims as possible, because every human life lost matters. We know that we would not be able to ever give a real estimate of the number of people killed, and we've insisted and stressed that our work is not for the purpose of giving an estimated figure. We want to document the details of the individuals on whom information is available, so that we remember their names and their stories. And already with the documentation of over 300 deaths, we believe the horrifying scale of the unlawful killings has been revealed to the world. We are not that hopeful that we would be able to identify many more victims. At this stage, if we try to verify the deaths reported by asking for the pictures of the gravestones of the individuals. The gravestones in Iran generally bear the name of the person, the name of their father, the date of birth, and the date of death. So they are a very good source for verifying all these various details. And as much as possible, we try to ask for death certificates and burial certificates, because they identify the cause of death and, again, the biographical information of the victim.
Okay, thank you for the answer. I just want to just explore that a little. I understand your reluctance to go beyond the 323, I think it was. But you're receiving, is this right? You're receiving evidence which on one view is quite persuasive. For example, photographs of memorials being held in a particular area would strike me as fairly persuasive, but unless you're finding corroborative evidence, you're recording that as unverified. Am I right? As an unverified, you're not including it into your verified numbers.
If we find memorial videos.
For example, a memorial video or a memorial poster or anonymous source reports the death of somebody, this would not...
We would. Basically, we analyze a wide range of information available online and obtained from various sources to see if the name reported reaches a level of accuracy to include it. For example,
but my point is, if you didn't receive any further corroboration, you wouldn't include it into your 323.
It depends. For example, if a memorial video is identified, where you can clearly see the name of the victim on a memorial poster, and then previously you had seen that name online somewhere, then we would try to look into it further. So we certainly wouldn't discount. There haven't been any memorial videos from an individual victim that we've discounted because we didn't have additional information. The names that we haven't included are those on whom almost nothing is available. So you just have some tweets from anonymous online users and nothing more. Right. And in some cases there is a picture, but because we've noticed through our extensive research that many pictures are being misattributed to the individual concerned, we are very careful. We need to make sure that there is a source who can tell us how they learned that picture belongs to the reported individual. We are strict because the Iranian authorities have a history of spreading false information about those who've been killed, and then subsequently they release propaganda videos saying human rights organizations have reported such and such person as having been killed, and this is fake, and then with one case they try to discredit the entire report. As a result, we need to maintain a balance between ensuring accuracy and preventing these efforts by the authorities, but also not being too strict so that more victims remain unrecorded.
Okay, thank you very much. That was clear, very clear. Thank you. Just one other area. In relation to the protests themselves and your conclusion that, and I tried to write it down, but you were speaking fairly quickly, but that there was almost no evidence that people being shot posed an imminent threat to life, words to that effect. Now, in your report at paragraph 29, you spoke about 2 neighborhood-level protests where gunfire was exchanged. So it's clear that your conclusion is that barely any of the protests, except for 2, involved protesters with guns. Now, I'm just wondering how you came to the conclusion that there was no imminent threat to life. We've got burnings of banks, burnings of vehicles, which obviously could pose a threat to life. And I'm just trying to understand how you came to the conclusion that, putting gunfire aside, which concerns just 2 protests, how you came to the conclusion that other actions of the protesters did not pose a threat to life or an imminent threat to life.
It's heavily based on the video footage available that corroborates the testimonies of eyewitnesses that when the security forces fired live ammunition, they were not faced with any imminent threat. Usually in the videos you see that the security forces are quite away and safely away from the protesters and without any provocation and for no clear reason showing a real risk to the lives or bodily integrity of security forces, they recklessly fire live ammunition at protesters who are unarmed and who are just standing together chanting slogans or, worst case scenario, throwing stones. And this pattern is consistent across various locations where we've recorded deaths. The context establishes that the security forces could have, first of all, the protests in many cases were predominantly peaceful, so the authorities were not even allowed to use force in the first place to disperse protests, let alone lethal force targeted at the head or torso of the protesters, which would have reasonably led to their death, and the security forces would have known that. There are also many videos which show protesters running away from the security forces while being shot at repeatedly by the security forces. As I mentioned, many were shot multiple times in their back while running away and in their upper body. And if even any imminent threat was conceivable, given the video evidence we see, they would have been able to target that individual and just immobilize them through a less lethal means. But that's not the pattern that emerges from the extensive video evidence. And for that, we've admired the courage of all those who took this footage despite all the risks involved. In the absence of that video evidence, it would have been very difficult to establish this clearly, that the use of lethal force was unlawful, given the authorities' reports that fire and arson and vandalism were committed. The Iranian authorities have followed a twofold strategy to distort the truth surrounding the killings, and these strategies are a bit contradictory. On the one hand, they've tried to justify the use of lethal force by saying they were protecting public property. Clearly, public property, damage to public property doesn't justify the use of lethal force. Their second strategy has been to deny that those firing lethal live ammunition belong to security forces. They've claimed that that most of the victims were killed by armed attackers and by suspicious weapons that do not belong to the security forces. And these two accounts do not basically match. It seems we've seen like a growing narrative by the authorities trying to just muddy the ground and conflate various issues. And just finally, when in June 2020, a former parliamentarian finally released the figure of 230 as the official number of people killed, I have the exact breakdown, but he admitted that many of those, I should refer to the figure if it's okay, but basically for, I should not rely on my memory, but for over 70% or 80%, I'll refer to it right now, he said the use of lethal force was for countering attacks against public buildings or security and detention facilities, but he also admitted that the attackers were not using arms. So in a way, it's an acknowledgement by the authorities that even when attacks were being waged, individuals were not in possession of arms or weapons that would have posed a serious threat to the lives of heavily armed security forces.
Thank you very much. I've got nothing further. Does Council have any? Oh, I bet do it first.
Yeah.
Sorry, one more.
Just a quick question. In your written statement, you indicate about the sexual violence against male detainees. Is it simply because you couldn't find evidence that was experienced by female detainees, or because of taboo to talk about sexual violence against women?
Unfortunately, we were not able to speak to many female detainees. And we really do not have any detailed information that would shed light on how female detainees were treated overall. That's why the information documented is focused on adult men and boys. I hope one day more information emerges about how women were treated. We tried, and we have women who were arrested. We have the cases of women who were arrested in the context of protests, but they were not subjected to sexual violence themselves, and they did not have any information that could help us with the analysis of that situation. Yeah, thank you.
Council, anything arising?
No, due to time, we are finished here.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your report and also for your evidence, which has been very clear and I'm sure will be very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your consideration.
Mr. Chairman, we are running quite late for today. We have 6 more witnesses for this morning, and unfortunately we have to vacate this room by 1:30, before 1:30, because 1:30 they want the building to be cleared from the tribunal today. So can we have only a 5 minutes break and then come back here immediately and continue, because we have very important witnesses this morning.
Absolutely, let's do that. So 5 minutes, let's be back for 5 to 12. Thank you.
All rise. All rise. Can you please cut off the... Please be seated. Mr. Chairman, due to time constraints, we can only hear 3 more witnesses before the break, which are witness 366, 128, and 195.
Thank you very much. Shall we move forward then with 366?
Yes. Called witness 366. Good morning. The witness, a young man, was shot in his arm and chest during the first day of demonstrations. At the time, he was 23 years old. He was taken to the hospital but was not treated properly. He was later taken to private hospital and the bullet was removed. Good morning, witness 366. The chairman would now ask you to repeat an oath.
Good morning, Mr. Witness. Would you repeat after me, please? I solemnly declare that I will speak the truth.
I solemnly swear to tell the truth.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
To tell the whole truth and not to say anything but the truth.
Thank you. Now, counsel will ask you a series of questions, and then that will be followed with questions from the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you please inform the tribunal how and when you were shot in the street?
On the 25th of Aban, approximately at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was there, but I have to tell you something. On the 24th of Aban, the price of petrol rose, and people wanted to have protests, and myself, I joined the others on the 25th of Aban. The protests were spontaneous, and until the noon, we had peaceful protests. In the afternoon, there were bullets flying and they started shooting people, and unfortunately I was also exposed to a bullet. I was shot by one, and the bullet hit me on my left arm, and also it went to my left lung, and ordinary people who were there took me to the hospital in a private car, and I was 1 or 2 hours at the hospital. Nobody was taking care of us until such time that the wounded people increased. Then the ordinary people were compelling the medical staff to take care of us, and it was almost 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon where they took me for a CT scan. and unfortunately, they realized that I could not breathe anymore, and I was in that hospital for a week, and they performed an operation on me, but I had no other operation, and they said that this bullet is going to stay on your spine. And then my family released me from the hospital, consented to that, and they transferred me to a private hospital. And fortunately, over there, the surgery was done there successfully, and they removed the bullet from my spine. So this was 2 years ago that I've had the surgery. And unfortunately, I have had no progress physically. My spine has had no progress. And as you can see, I'm sitting on a wheelchair now. When I was shot, I could not even sit for another 2 months afterwards, and I had to do exercises for 2 months to be able to sit. I couldn't sleep. I was like a newborn baby. The whole system of my body had been disrupted. I couldn't sleep comfortably. I could not be comfortable in my wakeful hours. Everything was disrupted, whether being awake or being asleep. And after 2 months, my body got used to the prevailing conditions, the existing conditions, and then I could at least sit down. If you have any other questions, I'm at your service to answer them.
Thank you. On Saturday, 16th of November, were there anyone else in the crowd that was posing a threat to the authorities? Were there anybody who had a gun or any similar weapon in his hand, in your knowledge or not?
You're talking about ordinary people?
Ordinary people. Were they totally peaceful, or were they creating any threat to the security forces?
No, I did not see anybody among the ordinary people to have a weapon. They all had the empty hands.
Did you give the tribunal a copy of your X-ray from your lung? And can we have it displayed? Is this the bullet in your body?
Yes.
Do you know who shot you, from which force?
The police force shot me. It was the police, and they were in the vehicle that belonged to them.
So it was not from anyone in the crowd, no?
No, they were separate. They were 150 meters away. That's to say, the police force, they started directly shooting people, and one of them hit me.
My final question. Your family had filed a complaint regarding your situation and being shot. Can you explain to the tribunal what has happened to that complaint and with which authority it has been filed?
We filed the complaint in the court in our own region twice. We complained, but it got nowhere.
Thank you. Thank you. The panel may have some questions for you.
Yes, please.
Good morning. Just a clarification on the last point. You said that the complaint got nowhere. Can you provide a little bit of detail? Did you receive a response, or was it just ignored?
The first time around, they gave a response and it said that the police force has said that they have not shot anybody. Once again, we complained and we said this is the situation. We saw that the police force shot us and they rejected the file and said that's not so.
So in both occasions, they claimed that it did not happen.
Once they said nothing had happened. The second time, they said that he has been a protester and he has been shot.
And is your understanding that it is permissible to shoot you because you're a protester? Why do you think they said that?
I do not know. There was only a statement that we read, and that's what it said, and therefore they said that they are closing the file.
And my last question, what had you hoped for when you filed the complaint?
نه هیچی نشیدم. من خودم
They could not file a complaint myself. I was bedbound. My family filed a complaint and said this is the problem that has arisen, but they closed the file. They did not do anything.
Sorry, I'll repeat my question. Maybe it wasn't clear. When the complaint was filed, what was your expectation of the complaint? What did you think would be a good result or a result from that complaint, or your family?
We filed a complaint so that they would know that a person with such and such identity has been shot, so that people would know. There was nothing else, nothing special.
Thank you very much.
Justice Jaku.
Thanks. I'm just interested, because you didn't say so in your evidence, there are facts in your statement about what you saw when you got to the first hospital. Now, I can't tell you what you said in your statement, but let's see how we go. Did they bring other patients to the hospital while you were there?
When I reached the hospital, 10 or 15 other people were brought there also, and there was one only who had been shot below the waist. All the others had been shot above the waist, either in the chest or elsewhere. And it means that they had all of them been shot with the intention to kill them. Only one person had been shot below the waist. So that was the 10 or 15 people who were brought to that hospital.
Thank you very much. That was a quick answer, and that's it. Thank you.
I think that's all the questions from the panel. Anything arising, Council?
No, sir. Thank you very much.
Mr. Witness, thank you very much for testifying before this tribunal. It's much appreciated. I know it cannot have been easy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was my fate, it seems. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, our next witness is witness 128. It appears at page 46 of your bundle.
Thank you very much for attending, Mr. Witness. Could you repeat after me, please? I solemnly declare that I will speak the truth.
I solemnly declare to tell the truth,
the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. There'll be some questions now from Council, and then that will be followed by some questions from the panel. Thank you.
The witness, a male Iranian from the province of Balochistan, on the border with Pakistan, witnessed the shooting by the security forces, injuring the demonstrators. Thank you for coming to London for this tribunal. Can you please explain briefly to the tribunal what you saw on 16th and 17th of November? Please bear in mind that the tribunal has your full report, and please briefly refer to the events that you witnessed.
It was a Saturday and a Sunday that it happened. On Friday, the price had risen, the price of petrol. And in our region, on Saturday and Sunday, we had protests. And in our region, they wanted to go to the city, and the Revolutionary Guards prevented them. And there were 2 people who were shot. And afterwards, Muhi Kuhi was arrested in Mashhad.
Did you personally witness that the security forces were shooting at the protesters?
Yes, yes.
Did you see anybody from the protesters carrying any weapons, arms, guns, or anything lethal with them?
None. No, they had nothing. They had come there with empty hands.
Was there any evidence that the protesters were creating any threat for the security forces, for their life and limb?
No. They wanted to go to the city of Rust, and they wanted to protest there. And for this reason, they would prevent them and would not let them advance. They were all gathering from villages to go to the city.
You have provided the Council with some videos. Can we have these are very short videos, Mr. Chairman. Can we have a look at those videos? Can you explain where this was and what was happening?
You can see that the Revolutionary Guards are preventing them to advance and go to the city of Rost. That's to say that 100 kilometers away from the city, those that you see are the Revolutionary Guards. They don't let them advance.
And the next video? Can you also explain what is happening here?
It's the same thing. They want to advance. They want to go further, but they don't let them.
And the last video, please. Never mind. In your statement, you have referred to Molavi Barakat, who spied on the demonstrators. Is there anything else you want to add in connection with his activities?
I don't know much about that. I live in Dubai. I only go there for 2 months, and I stay there for 2 months, and I come back. But I've heard that they are the spies, and they work with the Revolutionary Guards.
Thank you. That concludes our questions. The tribunal will have some question for you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I just have a few questions. Firstly, in the second video that was shown, there is a picture of fires which are in a row. I'm just wondering, do you know who lit those fires? Can you explain if you have any information?
It was the Baluchis in our region that had put fire to this so that vehicles could not pass through, so that the Revolutionary Guards could not pursue them.
Thank you. And I also had another question. In your written statement, you refer to someone who was protecting people in your area who was subsequently arrested. And who was given a 6-month prison sentence. Are you able to explain a little bit more about that?
This was a person who supported the protesters and said that they are not doing anything wrong. They are just protesting. And therefore, the Revolutionary Guards, they took him to the city of Mashhad, and they have given him a prison sentence of 6 years. Everybody knows that. Fazlur Rahman Puri, the whole of Baluchistan knows about it.
And are you aware of what he was convicted of? What was his the charge, and what was he convicted of? If you're aware.
His crime was that why he was charged with the crime of defending the protesters.
Thank you.
In the first video, you said that you could see the Revolutionary Guard blocking the way. Can you explain to me who from the people there were the Revolutionary Guard? Is it by the way that they're dressed, or the vehicles that you could tell that they were? I'm not following the image very clearly. So where are the Revolutionary Guards?
They were about 200 meters away. They were all the IRGC officers. People couldn't go any further because they would have shot them. People are afraid.
And you recognize them because of their uniform or because of the vehicles? How do you recognize them as the Revolutionary Guards?
They were the IRGC because they had machine guns. They had military uniform. They had special emblems.
Thank you.
Okay. Justice Yaqub. Could I have just ask a couple of questions, please? What was the objective of going to the city? And secondly, why did the state authorities want to prevent that, from what you know?
The reason was that all the villagers wanted to go to the city. There are courts in the city. There are also military personnel in the city. The world would have known that people have gathered in the cities. That's why they blocked the villages not to go to the city, so that the cities couldn't get any overcrowded.
And in your statement, you've spoken about some of the protesters throwing stones towards the police and them throwing tear gas canisters at you. I just want to try to understand the level of violence between the protesters and the police. Did anything else happen in regards to violence?
No, that was all. They fired tear gas, and the protesters were throwing stones. They were far from each other. They were about 100 meters away from each other.
And then there's a sudden, don't let me put words into your mouth, but is there then an escalation whereby the police and the Revolutionary Guard then start to fire live ammunition, causing injury, dispersing the crowds? Is that how it happened, or is there something I'm missing in that factual pattern?
It was exactly what you explained.
Thank you. No more questions from the panel, Council?
Just one question. In the second video, the fires that you see are the fires that are lit by the tires that are burning. Is that correct?
Yes, the tires were put on fire.
Thank you. Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you very much for coming. Very useful evidence, and we're grateful that you've taken the time and made the effort to give evidence to the tribunal. Thank you.
I wish you health, good health for all of you.
Mr. Chairman, our next witness is witness number 195. It appears on page 56 of your file. For security reasons, the witness voice is not, you would not hear the witness voice, but one of the members of the tribunal will repeat the witness's statements. But I will say that in Persian as well. برای اطلاع شما شاهد بعدی با صدای خود شهادت نخواهد داد، بلکه صدای یکی از اعضای تریبونال خواهد بود. Good morning, or good afternoon. The chairman will ask you to repeat the oath.
Mr. Witness, can you hear me? Mr. Witness, can you hear me? Mr. Witness, can you hear me?
Mr. Chairman, the witness has some difficulty in unmuting his voice, but let's see whether he can hear you now.
Mr. Witness, can you hear me? So if you can hear me, can you nod your head? Or unmute your computer or phone? Can you speak and confirm you can hear me?
Mr. Chair, he can hear you.
Oh, he can. Okay, thank you. Can you repeat after me, please? I solemnly declare that I will speak the truth.
I solemnly declare to say the truth.
Whole truth and nothing but the truth.
To say the whole truth and to say nothing but the truth.
Thank you. There'll be some questions now from Council, and then that will be followed by some questions from the panel. Thank you.
The witness is a police officer with the rank of major. He commanded a group of 60 police officers and was assigned during the November 2019 to the city of Mariwan. The witness ordered his force not to shoot at the demonstrators. The witness was then prosecuted and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. The sentence has not yet been carried out. Witness 195, can you please explain to the tribunal the event that you witnessed on Sunday, 17th November in Mariwan?
I would like to express my greetings to the honorable panel, to the prosecutors. On 23rd of Aban, 1398, about 60 people were under my command, and I was dispatched to one of the provinces of Iran. And I was supposed to go and get based in a particular center from 18th to 25th of Aban. From 25th of Aban to 1st of Azar, I was based there. And the peaceful protests started. The forces that were under my command were determined, and we had some plainclothes officers who were also based in the four corners of the governor's office, Sepah Bank, and also the residential complex of Imam. And there was some coordination made with the management of the complex so that the individuals could be placed there for filming and also for putting weapons on the top of the roofs.
Could I just pause? Sorry, Mr. Witness, just pause a second. I'm just a bit concerned, and the panel's a bit concerned that the detail that he's giving may reveal his identity.
Yes. Please make sure that no reference is made to the city or the province that you were assigned to.
I received an order to shoot from the head of the district The voice gets cut off all the time, sorry.
کسب تکلیف و دستور توی
I received an order by the Provincial Security Council. I received an order to shoot from the Provincial Security Council, and the governor, as the head of the Provincial Security Council, issued the order, and also the representative of the province, the head of the prosecutor's office, the commanders of the military forces, including the IRGC, Army and the police, formed the Provincial Security Council, and that Provincial Security Council issued the order to shoot. Any direct order by the Provincial Security Council concerning using firearms or other weapons are being issued by this council. The peaceful demonstrations by the people were totally peaceful. And I was asked to go and be based in the place of my mission assignment. And I briefed my forces that under every condition, they do not have the right to use firearms. And the number of the forces who I felt who enjoyed greater patience I just provided them with firearms, but at the same time I briefed them not to use those firearms. I verbally briefed them and tried to also calm down the protesters. Unfortunately, no problem occurred. And fortunately, we were able to overcome the protests without any conflict. The protesters who had gathered also cooperated to the utmost extent, to the utmost level with the officers, and they were very polite. And any tension was prevented until at a part of the city we could hear that there were firing heard. We could hear that Kalashnikov was being fired, and there were some other sounds of weapons being fired. Until a number of armed individuals with semi-military clothing and armed, started to shoot without any aim and without any purpose, just with the purpose of intimidation, just with the purpose of intimidating the protesters, started to attack them. After a while, some groups were formed. And the people were shouting to the police, "Support us, support us." Until at a certain time, one of the IRGC officers contacted me through walkie-talkie and ordered that we should take our forces to the central boulevard of the city and the gas station. I did not do so because it was not a part of my job. The forces that were under my force should have been patiently preventing the protesters from committing any destruction. And then we saw that some of the plainclothes people who had arms, and also the RGC forces, and some of the people who were wearing the local clothes of that city started to shoot at the people. And this led to increase in tension. And as a result, the protesters were provoked. The suppressing forces, as far as I am aware, included army personnel, the people from the intelligence, IRGC, and also forces from the other organs, mostly state organs, and also military forces who started to fire. And some of them did not have any emblem or any sign. There were some who fired at will. Without any purpose or reason. And I may also say that nobody was ever questioned for the type of the weapons that they used. This is why the police force, if they were using any ammunition, at the end, their ammunition should have been written down on the minutes of meeting. And it should have been clarified how many bullets were shot. This is what I'm talking about is on the 27th of Aban. On the 28th of Aban,
the atmosphere was a bit calmer and things calmed down, and there were some scattered gatherings here and there in the city. In each one of them, there were 50 or 60 people, and this is what was reported to us. And nothing special, no special incident was taking place either. Many of the wounded would not even go to the hospitals themselves because of the consequences that could arise for their families later on. On the 27th, the bodies of 15 people were located in the morgue of the hospital. And on the 25th of the month of Esfand, through a ruling that was issued from the magistrate of a city that I'm not going to name, without having received any summons. I was arrested by the security forces, and without any kind of explanation or justification, was taken to the detention center that belonged to the intelligence forces of the Revolutionary Guards, and I spent weeks in solitary confinement. I was subjected to the most serious types of psychological torture. It was not physical, though. And if I can give you one example of the torture to the honorable judges here, for myself, who was in solitary confinement, they had made up a paper, a report from the forensic medicine to the effect that my family, while they were moving to another city, have had an accident, and their bodies are in the morgue now. So this was a forged document that they had made, and they were showing to me. And for this reason, of course, I went on a hunger strike. After many weeks, they gave me the permission to contact them. And just to say a few words to my family. The interrogator had said that this is a security file, and therefore I would not have any access to the file. It means that I had no access to my own case file. After 2 months, it was announced to my family that from among the 5 lawyers who are approved by the judiciary, one person I had to choose on the basis of the list that I had been given. And of course, at the end, in this mock trial that was held in the branch 4 of the city that I was, which was a military court without the presence of a prosecutor or a jury, I was tried only for 10 minutes, and then I was immediately condemned to 5 years in prison and a separate 10 months of prison term. Taking into consideration that their verdict is considered definite, final, I will not have any right for any appeals. I did object to this in the Supreme Court, and and once again, they also approved the verdict that had been issued for me. So this was all my story. This was all that I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Can you tell the tribunal whether you witnessed whether Revolutionary Guards snipers were at the top of government buildings and other high buildings and shooting at the demonstrators?
بله من
Yes, I saw them. I saw that they shot people, but they were just targeting anybody. There was no rhyme or reason to it.
Can you explain to the tribunal how the Revolutionary Guards reacted to the peaceful protest of the demonstrators?
به صورت لحظه‌ای
People had gathered on the streets peacefully. And they were by paramilitary forces and a number of military people who were plainclothes military people were arbitrarily shot, and they intimidated them.
Thank you. The tribunal will have some questions for you now.
Justice Yakub.
Thank you. Please don't answer any questions that will reveal your more about you than has already been done. I am interested in what you know of police practices. Now, please don't confine them to the area in which you were. I want to talk generally about what you know of police practices. No names, no details or anything, because I'm afraid you may be identified. Now, they are all.
The practice of the police force when there are protests or gatherings is that there are forces to control the gatherings. And they have what we call cold arms, that's to say truncheons, they have shields, and they also have a special clothing in order to be able to control the crowds.
Yes,
that's to say that they come in groups, but come in different groups. And when you have 4 groups, they have one commander, and each group has 9 members. And these 9 individuals act according to the instructions of the commander. And when there are peaceful protests, they come first and encounter them, they talk to them, and through a loudspeaker, they warn people. And then that's how they do it to the extent possible. And then ultimately, if the gathering starts, that's to say, if the protesters start destroying something, then they come and they use their truncheons on them. And they try to scatter the protesters that are allowed to take that action. And if using the truncheon does not work, then they will have different deployments that they call pecan deployment, lozenge deployment, etc. All they want to do is to intimidate the crowds. That's to say, there are a number of military maneuvers that they take in order to intimidate the crowds. If it doesn't come to any kind of a conclusion, as I said, they use the truncheons, they use the tear gas. And so these are the control forces, and they use two kinds of weapons, that's to say the truncheons and also the equipment that personally protects them, plus the tear gas that is at the disposal of these groups. That's to say there's one person in each group that has the equipment in order to project and throw the tear gas. So when the problem is not solved through them, that's to say when a decision is reached, then you will have the IRGC forces and they will have the other paramilitary or the militia forces. Then you have the forces from other organs who are armed with weapons. They are prepared and ready to act very quickly, to be present in the location, to crack down the protests. So that's the next stage.
Now, I understand that all that you say should happen, because that is the usual procedure, and that's what the procedure should be. Now, what I want to ask you is, to your knowledge, do people in the police force always follow the procedure?
متوجه نشدم.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question.
Okay, let me put it a bit more simply. The rules that you described just now are what police people should do if they act properly and according to what they are told to do. Now, do you have knowledge of people in the police force who don't obey the rules and who do things outside the rules?
همچین چیزایی هم پیش میاد.
Yes, these things happen. Unfortunately, it has always been so. In the Iranian police force, taking into consideration depending on the psychology of the person who is in charge, that could happen. It is possible that there is a member of the police force who has all kinds of constraints, physical, psychological, financial, and it is possible that willingly does something instead of calling him sick and say that I cannot go and act. If he does that, then he will be prosecuted in courts. In Iran, there is no organization that takes care of the psychological aspects of the members of the police force. When you send somebody to act under such circumstances, what the psychology of the person is and how he might react. That's it. There is no such care for them.
Apart from those policemen who have psychological problems, with whom I have considerable sympathy, are there senior people in the police force who carry out instructions that they are given from higher authority, even if it means acting unlawfully, they carry it out without question?
Even if it is unlawful, they do it. That's to say that the commander comes and gives an order and says this is something that has to be done. If it is done, it's done. That's to say, if it is not, then it will be a hanging noose on the neck of the person who did not do it, not the commander. Even if it is against the laws and regulations, and even if there is somebody who objects to this person, to this agent, the police force, that's to say those in charge who are seniors and who are the higher ups, they are not going to protect the lower one. That's to say everybody just wants to take care of their own affairs, take care of their own interests.
Now, if there was evidence that there were instructions from above during the protests in November, which said that the protests must be stopped at all costs, regardless, and that police people must shoot to kill and not use the normal processes. That came as a general instruction. Do you know anything about an instruction like that, a general one which came from really high up?
What do you mean at the highest level? At the decision-making level of the police force, IRGC, and the army, and the intelligence forces, you mean? When the order of the Provincial Security Council is issued on using firearms, then the firearms are being used without questioning it. And nobody thinks of its repercussions, and nobody will will face any consequences, any repercussions after.
Is that practiced within the police force during times of protest, like in November?
The police force is comprised of teams. We've got special units, and these special units do not use firearms, but there are some other forces in the police force, intelligence-related police officers. They wear plain clothes. Sometimes they could have any form of clothes, and then they start shooting. They may do anything, but they would not be identified. But the population control unit, the special unit, the relief unit, and also the security unit, units of the police which have police uniform, have emblems, they are being seen, and I've never seen them to commit such acts.
One last question. I read in a book somewhere that police sometimes make fires in big institutions because they want to blame the public for those fires. And that's why they go quietly in plain clothes and wear them. I don't know whether it's just a story or what, but can that happen in your experience?
It has happened several times. I've seen it myself. There were protests that could have been controlled. There were no problems. The protests were completely peaceful. No destruction had taken place. And no problem had occurred anywhere. But unfortunately, for example, someone started to destroy public property with a free will and started to put fire on buildings, on people's cars, and they tried to cause tension, and as a result, a protest that could have been controlled without any problem then becomes out of control.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I thought these writers of novels always talk lies, but thank you very much for your help. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I just have several points of clarification. You did mention that there was an order to shoot which was issued by the Provincial Security Council. Are you able to give any more details about this order? Was it an order to shoot in the air, to shoot people in the leg, to shoot to kill? Was there any specificity with respect to this order?
The order to shoot means to shoot. That is to say, they are trying to somehow acquit themselves. They say that observing the rules of using weapons, the rules of observing weapons against the protests that lead to destruction of property cannot be really implemented. What does that mean, the rule observing the legal boundary of using weapons? If that is to be observed, you have to say stop, stop, stop 3 times, and then you have to shoot in the air once, and then you have to shoot in the legs below the waist. But this is not what is happening in the protests. They issue such orders, and the order that is being issued by the Provincial Security Council is to use the weapons observing the rules of using firearms. And after that, they wouldn't care what happens and under what conditions the officer has shot, whether the individual observed the law or the rules or not. In other words, I should say that some of these soldiers and police personnel don't know how to use weapons. They have never had any practice, any training. They are just being given some weapon and to go and suppress the people. The only thing that they can do at that moment is to pull the trigger. They don't know where they shoot at.
Thank you.
It's not important for them where they shoot.
Thank you. And in respect of this order to shoot, when it became clear that the shooting was resulting in deaths, so in other words, the rules regarding use of firearms was not being complied with, was there any subsequent order or clarification coming from the Provincial Security Council after the initial order?
No, not at all.
Thank you. And
the order that they issued they don't pursue their order afterwards. It's not important for them what happens afterwards anyway.
Thank you. And you may not be aware of this, but are you aware whether other provincial security councils gave the same order at the same time?
The Provincial Security Council make their own decisions. The Provincial Security Council decides, and after a telephone call, they coordinate the issue with the province. They say such a thing has happened, and this is the decision that has been made. And then there would be no written correspondence. They won't wait for any written response. It's just a telephone call. That's it.
Thank you. And in your written evidence, we have been led to understand that you were redeployed on the 14th of November in anticipation of potential problems. Can you indicate what problems were anticipated already on the 14th of November?
I could not really understand your question. I don't know exactly what 14th of November is in the Iranian calendar.
Is Council able to assist with that?
14th of November would be Thursday, 24th of Aban, or 23rd of Aban, yes.
Perhaps just to clarify my question, my understanding is that the announcement of the fuel.
What do you mean by 23rd of Aban,
yes.
Thursday?
Yes, I think so.
So my understanding is that the announcement about the fuel increases only came a day later. So my question is, what was being anticipated and what was the reason for your deployment?
The reason was that the rumors among the people had heard some rumors that the petrol prices would go up. The petrol stations had become so crowded on Wednesday and on Thursday, and people were trying to store petrol using tanks, even though it hadn't been announced that the petrol prices would increase. How did people understand that the prices would increase? Why were they trying to store petrol in the jerry tanks and other ways? Somehow they had heard about it. Somehow they anticipated that this would happen.
Thank you.
You refer several times to military or police forces being in plain clothes. Can you explain how, or just clarify how you can identify them as army or police forces if they are in plain clothes? How can you distinguish them from the protesters?
There are some particular areas, and every area have got their own local clothing, local way of garments, and they usually have hockey clothes, and they usually wear the clothes that are worn in the area. So plain clothes or semi-military clothes, when we talk about, it means that they have their own shoes, but the trousers is a military trousers. They don't have any emblem. They don't have any hat, helmet. These are semi-military. These are militia. It is clear how they wear their clothes. From the color of their clothes, we could know to where they belong. For example, the special forces wear black clothes. The relief forces, they wear green clothes, olive green. The RGC forces, they wear special clothes which is a combination of green and cream.
No, I understand that there are people wearing uniformed clothes and that those are easily identifiable, but if I'm not mistaken, you did reference that there would be paramilitary forces and then others wearing plain clothes, and they're the ones that shot and intimidated the protesters. And so I'm interested in understanding a little bit more about how the plain clothed officers or paramilitaries were identified as such as opposed to protesters, as opposed to being protesters.
When the plainclothes people have weapons, hold weapons, and they've got a walkie-talkie, and they have cartridges on their clothes, you would know that they are not private individuals. But when they have walkie-talkies, when they have a commander, when they come in a group and in teams, so you know to where they belong. They don't just come in groups of one or two. If there are armed groups in a popular group, there would be one or two people who are armed. But we see that there are 20 people suddenly appearing in the population, all of them wearing similar clothes, all of them have cartridges on, they have covered their faces, and they all have weapons in hands, they have walkie-talkies, so you would realize that they do not belong to the people.
Thank you, that's very clear. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may intervene at this stage, and I've been asked to answer the concern that has been shown over the social media with the identity of the witness and his safety, just to declare that he's in a safe place, and the reason that his face is covered is not to identify him in the public places.
Thank you, Counsel. Can I ask a few questions? And I'm sorry to go back to the order from the Provincial Security Council. I just don't quite follow exactly how you understood the order on the 16th. In your statement, you say that the Security Council had clearly told us, and I'm quoting, quote, "The Security Council had clearly told us that the use of firearms was permitted." And then you say they issued no orders for us on the 16th of November. Do you recall saying that in your statement?
Yes, I remember when the gathering happened, when the gathering started and the protests started. The area that was under my control, nothing happened in that area. It is true that we received an order to shoot. But this does not mean that I should just shoot because I have received an order. There were no problems around me. Why should I have started shoot?
Sorry to interrupt. I want to just try to focus in on this issue. Did you, at any time on the 16th or 17th, receive an order from the Provincial Security Council to shoot protesters?
On the 27th of Aban, there was an explicit order through the walkie-talkie. They are not going to give you a written order. They are going to announce it through the walkie-talkie. And the announcers...
Okay, what was the order as best you remember receiving it without revealing your identity? What was the wording of the order? you received through the walkie-talkie?
The order that they issued was that the use of firearms is permitted.
But you're a police officer. You, I presume, had a firearm, and under certain circumstances, firearms were always permitted. Am I correct?
It depends. I am. If I'm a police officer and I see somebody is trying to kill somebody else, yes. But in such a case, I am duty bound to use it. And of course, I still have to observe a number of rules. For example.
Okay. So you've got to use, you can use firearms, you've got to observe certain rules. So what I'm trying to understand is, if you receive an order which simply says firearms are permitted, how do you understand that, since you already know that they're permitted under certain circumstances? How did you understand that order at the time you received it?
That when the order comes to me, when I am supposed to protect a particular place, I have to do whatever is in my capability. And if none of that works at the very end, then I use the firearm. And even then, I have to shoot in the air. Ultimately, I mean, the last recourse.
Sorry. I just really want you to focus in on the question. I'm trying to understand what you understood that order to mean. You as a police officer, as you've testified, you understood that you were, in ordinary circumstances, allowed to use your firearm subject to certain rules, correct? Right.
Yes, that's correct.
So when you receive an order from the Provincial Security Council telling you that firearms are permitted to be used during the protest, how do you understand that order? Since it on the face of it, it's just telling you what you already know. Do you understand my query?
Yes. It's due to the fact that it says in any way possible you have to crack down on the protests. You have to finish it off. It has to finish.
That's what I was trying to understand, how you'd understood it. So you understood that order to mean that you should crack down on the protesters and end the protest by any means, or how did you understand you were supposed to?
By any means possible, it has to finish.
And in terms of shooting protesters, how did you understand the order related to that specifically? What did you understand the order now allowed you to do?
To be when via the walkie-talkie you are informed, that's to say when the person in charge announces to you, it goes through a code. Every commander has a code, and they come and take a quotation from that code. And you also have to announce your situation. When they announce it to you, you have to say, yes, I am such and such a person. And once they identify you, then they announce the order to you, and once they do it, then you have to confirm that you have received the order. And the person who is issuing the order is somebody who is a commander. He is in the communication center. And then there's an office which also registers it and says such and such an order was given to such and such a person. The situation was announced. The person said that he got the message, got the order. That's the extent of it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Witness. Just one other quick area concerning your arrest and subsequent conviction. Without revealing your identity, how did you understand the general charge? What is it that you'd failed to do, according to those who were charging you?
On the 25th of Sfand, I went to work at 9 o'clock in the morning. And the security forces came to me and, for example, they took the telephone handset away from me and they said...
So, sorry to interrupt. I just want to understand what it is you were alleged to have failed to do. How did you understand it? What was said to you? What was your failure?
Cooperation and coordination with protesters, with rioters, and non-compliance with the order that was given to me by a Revolutionary Guards officer. The order that had been given to me by a Revolutionary Guard, I should have complied with it. They were not in my hierarchy. They were themselves settled in a place, in a gas station which was set on fire, etc. I don't know. I don't know what had happened thereafter, but to help them, they announced it to me via the walkie-talkie that immediately I had to go such a particular location. Well, the gas station had burned down. What was I to do? To help with what?
So, just so I understand, the order from the Revolutionary Guard, this is the same order from the Provincial Security Council? The order you've just referred to as not following?
No. The order that comes from the Provincial Security Council to the effect that you are permitted to use firearms when there are protests, that's one. But they had also divided the surface of the city to different areas. The area that they had given to me, well, no problems arose there.
What was the order from the Revolutionary Council that you'd failed to follow, according to the charge?
The order that I did not follow up and did not comply with was the order issued by a person, by an individual, who could have been lower in rank than I was. I am not supposed to comply with his order.
Sorry, Mr. Witness, I just want to understand what the order was. What was the order given? I'm not so interested at the moment in who gave it to you and whether he was entitled to give it to you. I just want to know what the order was.
3 minutes.
The order, it was that within 10 minutes you have to go on foot to such and such a place. Leave your area of command and go to such and such a place. To go to that place where a gas station had been set to fire. And to join a trend that they themselves had not been able to control. That's to say, they had not been able to control for the gas station not to be set on fire.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Witness. I've got nothing further. That's all the questions, I think, from the panel. And over to you, Mr. Sabi. Do you have anything arising?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. No further questions. And in fact, we have to vacate this room in the next 2 minutes. So.
Mr. Witness, thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate it. We understand how difficult it is to testify about these issues, and we really will study your evidence with real care. Thank you very much. Okay, so we adjourn until tomorrow, I think at 9:30.
9:30 in the morning.
Thank you very much.